Good morning. Okay, so I'm going to present the pilot study or the proposed pilot study for Tanzania. I'm Joel Nobert from the University of Dar es Salaam, Tanzania. So basically our study is focusing on the trade-offs between land uses in the southern highlands of Tanzania. And this is still at proposal stage, and so I'll try to explain mainly on the methodology and how you're going to apply the TEEBAgriFood framework. So as part of that one, I'm going to start with the introduction of the study area. The study area is going to be in the southern highlands of the country. And this is mainly on the Rufiji River Basin and is in the upper catchment for the Ruaha catchment and also for the Kilombero River Basin. This is one of the very important regions for agriculture, and is also, the Rufiji Basin is also the basket for food for the country, and that means it's important for the food security, water security, as well as energy production. And just to give you an overview, the schematic diagram of the basin itself. So our study is going to focus in the upstream part of the Kilombero Basin, the circled area there, and also the part of the upper basin of the Great Ruaha, basically looking of the Barari area. And then on this part of Kilombero, we are looking at mainly areas around Jombe and Makete and all these highland areas. So this study area site was taken because of the importance in the country. If you go with the Kilombero system, as you go further downstream, we have the Kilombero Ramsar site, and we have several hydropower systems within the system. And then it goes down, and if you come from the Great Ruaha site, so in the upstream part, we have potential for pine plantations, we have different agricultural productions which is taking place, but we have the hydropower systems as you go further downstream, and also the Ruaha National Parks as you go further downstream. And all this system will go then again further downstream. Again, we have some potential hydropower systems as you go further downstream. So these are just some of the photos. This is in the Kilombero Basin. This was some years back. There was eviction of the pastoralists in the Kilombero Basin, because they were invading the Kilombero Valley, mainly the Ramsar site areas. So the eviction which was taking place, and these are some of the irrigation schemes which is going on, and this is the tomato growing in the Jombe, and then we have some irrigation schemes which are taking place. So as part of introduction, what you're saying is that before the 1980s, the natural ecosystem in the upland areas of the southern highlands were largely mountain grasslands, which are often scattered with natural woodland patches along the drainage areas. But in the 1980s, this ecosystem came under rapid pine forestation, transforming the ecosystem into artificial forest and transforming some of the grasslands into croplands. And what was observed is that there was a shrinkage of mountain grasslands and wetlands, which are associated with the drying up of formerly perennial rivers and streams during the dry seasons, and heavy flooding during the wet season or during the rainy season. So the objective of this study is mainly to mainstream the values of nature in decision making by highlighting the several trade-offs made in land use decisions, which are usually not captured through the conventional strategic impact assessment. So this will include contribution of the nature to agricultural production, both positive and negative impacts of agriculture and on biodiversity, human health, and other links of agricultural system with communities and ecosystems. So as part of the methodology, the first one is the definition of study scope and scenarios to be compared. So the first one is delineation and mapping of the southern highlands and associated subcatchments. And then we'll look at land use policy and management review in each catchment. Basically, this is going to include responses to the following questions, which are site-specific. For example, what are the current agricultural, non-agricultural land uses in the southern highlands? What are the current land use systems and existing community-based management plans? What are the agencies involved in making policies and managing land use in the southern highlands? And then a mapping of planned development projects, especially as they relate to water use within the watershed. And then the next step is going to be more of data collection, so it's biophysical and valuation data. So we'll go to the details of data availability and also try to do the data gap filling through the modeling. So this study is mainly going to use some extensive literature review, mainly looking at the published reports, the interviews, multi-stakeholder consultation, which is going to include other research institutes, ministries, NGOs working in the regions, to determine the biophysical data availability for natural capital as well as ecosystem services, and then look at identification and filling of critical data gaps through application of different methodologies, for example, like remote sensing, biophysical modeling, and also some field surveys and stakeholder community consultation. So then we'll go to the next step, which is mainly on the scenario analysis, and basically this is the knowledge of the relationship between the land use and ecosystem services. Particularly, we'll look at water quality, issue of water quantity, food production, regional food security, and we'll also examine the trade-offs in different land use scenarios. So basically, we're going to look at different scenarios or the policy scenarios and strategies, and we'll apply the TEEBAgriFood framework that is going to include evaluation of the natural produce, human and social capital stocks on all associated positive and negative impacts of predicted changes to these stocks under different future scenarios. And then we look at value chains from production to consumption. Will be described for each land use category within the basin, looking at agriculture, grassland, mainly livestock grazing, plantation forest, and any other natural or non-cultivated land cover. And the project is going to have business as usual scenario, and then we'll also look at alternative policy scenarios as well. And in stakeholder participation, because of the multidisciplinary and multidimensional nature, the study will involve consultation with diverse stakeholders at different times during the project implementation. The stakeholders will include mainly the small and large scale farmers. We are going to have the tree growers and investors on tree growing, upstream and downstream water users, local government authorities, Tanzania Investment Center, the representatives of SAGOT. And as part of community strategy, in order to generate the uptake of policy recommendations, the team will need to engage in both formal and informal consultation with key change agents, which includes different institutions, for example, the Vice President Office, Ministry of Agriculture, Ministry of Natural Resources and Tourism, Ministry of Water, Tanzania Wildlife Research Institute, Tanzania Forestry Research Institute, Ministry of Livestock, SAGOT Center, Ministry of Energy, Tanzania National Electric Supply Company, Tanzania National Parks, Tanzania Wildlife Authority. So these are some of the institutions which we think are very key for communicating the results, and we'll try to also apply the knowledge we get in the first day. For example, we'll try to look at what do you want them to hear, what do you want them to know, what do you want them to feel, and what do you want them to do, looking at the motivators, for example, in terms of economy, in terms of health, in terms of environment. And then maybe very briefly where we are now. We had Inception Workshop last year, which was attended by UNEP, and it was last year, I think August 2018, and then which was followed with the formation of the steering committee. So we are still at proposal stage, and so that's all I can present. Thank you very much.
Very much. Let's take about 10-15 minutes for questions before we go to the next session. So with that, can I ask if anyone has any questions they want to ask to any of the panelists, or any general remarks? Preferably questions. We have lots of comments today. Any questions first? Any questions? Yeah, Pietro.
A small question, more curiosity. I was wondering, what's the time frame of these projects? Is it like quarter, a year, or more than a year?
I can answer that. The time frame of the project, currently the project ends the end of this year. We may seek an extension from the IKI Secretariat for various reasons, but currently ends the end of this year. Any other questions or comments to the panel?
I have a question, not necessarily for the panel, but I mean, I see that there is agri-food complexes are really complex and huge systems, no? How do you identify probability to change, to really insight, so that you can change the system and the path that the system is taking. I don't know if I made myself understand.
I think, well, sorry? Does anyone on the panel want to answer that, or? It's a very, okay, I would suggest it's probably quite a difficult question in some respects. So what we have to do, my previous answer, is we have been, the reason it's taken a long time with IKI countries, we've been very, very precise in defining, as far as we can, the scenarios. And the scenarios look at different intervention options, which include inputs to the system. The inputs in the end, and the changes inputs to the system, in the end we're looking at, because they're creating outcomes, which we propose are going to be beneficial in terms of livelihoods and terms of conservation outcomes. So we always have to look for changes in terms of inputs to the system which are viable, credible, for which there's a governance structure for that input change to occur. But as you pointed out, and you've seen in the last 2 days, the complexity of that is very large. And even getting to that point and decide on that intervention is a really interesting and instructive process. And I think we can say that certainly in each of the 4 stakeholder meetings, there were situations, for instance, where agriculture and ecosystems ministries were talking about this really for the first time as a consequence of our project. So even as you were mentioning in terms of the Millennium Institute, it very much is the case that even the process of applying the TEEBAgriFood study creates benefits, I would argue, which are very different than, say, for instance, an academic research proposal, say when I was at Edinburgh, where the academic decides in advance, but I'm looking at this compared to this, I'm now going to do it. Yeah? So there's been a 2-year process to make that happen, and a very constructive process today. Any other further questions or comments on the studies? Okay. Yes, please. Yasmin, go ahead.
I have a comment on what has been discussed also by Colombia, the difficulty of also including the agricultural sector. And I just wanted to share our experiences from Mexico and from our Inception workshop, which we held last week, because actually at this workshop we had like 50% from the agricultural sector participants and 50% from the environmental sector, and the workshop was actually hosted by the Agriculture Ministry. So maybe this is just of interest to the participants here, how we did it. I mean, on the one hand, we have a positive political situation at the moment in Mexico, but what we also did is that during the last years when we prepared starting the study, we very much focused our dialogue with the Agriculture Ministry on positive experiences. So there has been a lot of difficulties in the dialogue between the agricultural and the environmental sector, because also in Mexico there's a lot of subsidies, or there have been a lot of subsidies with negative impacts on the environment, but we kind of not mentioned it. When we engaged with the agricultural sector, we were looking a lot into their programs on agro biodiversity and genetic diversity in the agricultural sector. We picked a lot of case studies with small-scale farmers that we have, and every time we engaged with them, we only looked at the positive sides to really include them as part of the solution. And I think that is why we got this positive uptake from the agricultural sector and them really leading this TEEB approach. Because, yeah, even though there are a lot of problems with the agricultural sector, we focused on the positive examples. Just as a lessons learned from our first steps on TEEB, which might be helpful also for other countries.
Thank you, Yasmin. That is very helpful. And I think we've tried to do that. And then what I'll probably do is ask the panelists, and each of them in turn have mentioned this, but basically the challenges you faced in terms of the interaction and trying to get what may not be your core constituency on board. So I'll ask in a second. But just to say, what I presented on day 1 to introduce and day 2 to introduce, in terms of suggesting and presenting that TEEBAgriFood is not agriculture bashing, was taken through to Inception workshops as well. It was also taken through to the earlier dialogues that we had, even before the Inception workshops, with the ministries to make sure that they understood exactly what this project was about, and it was trying to create positive synergies, when in many cases agriculture and environment seem to be in conflict. And obviously, in terms of political economy, it's very sensible to steer away from certain issues which might be politically very, very sensitive, which we've tried to do as well. But why don't I just, as a final comment to the panel then, or question, you've touched on it already, but maybe go through, if you have any final comments, but particularly if you can talk about the interaction between agriculture and environment, and indeed other ministries, and the process of making that happen, how difficult it was, what you managed to achieve.
So I already mentioned part of this in the presentation. Effectively, we've had trouble getting good participation from our agricultural ministry in particular, but we've tried to also focus on agencies that are part of the ministry and not directly the authorities, so we've got some participation from them. And we are developing strategies through partners that we already have to be able to get there. So we are partners with the Agricultural Research Institute of the country. So through them, we might be able to get more attention. Of course, framing and steering away from any of the maybe contradictory parts is definitely part of the strategy. What has been also a problem for us is during these years, we're changing government and with a very different perspective from the previous one. So we did a lot of the previous work with the old one. Now we have a new one, so we have to start over. That happens.
A generic feature of what we're doing in the TEEB world. I mean, we're talking in general about 3-year projects, and we tend to find we tend to be in every case in the middle of some political changeover or catastrophe or both. Okay, so it's very, very difficult. We have to allow for the fact that there is a political economy here. This is a 3-year project. We have to allow for the fact there'll be changes, sometimes for the better, sometimes for the worse. Better or worse, I don't mean in any kind of, only in the sense that we have a certain agenda into livelihoods and conservation, and it can be very complicated for the project to try and realign ourselves, even if that realignment is actually potentially beneficial, each time there's a change. And that doesn't apply just in Colombia, it applies across many of the countries we work in.
Maybe as a response, one of the things we've actually done is try to not only engage high, I guess, decision makers, but also technical practitioners that are more steady, at least in Colombia.
Thank you very much. For the Kenyan case, we didn't have at least challenges in the first instance because we took a different strategy of trying to do, we did meetings, dialogue at ministry level, capitalizing on the relationship that we had with our institution, National Museums of Kenya. So we did several meetings before the inception workshop, like 3 months before that, engaging officers, responsible officers for the Ministry of Environment and Ministry of Agriculture. So, but the only challenge that we faced was because of the time lapse. Once you talk to one officer in charge of the ministry, there were like transfers, so we really had to restart again to engage new officers in the ministry. But it went very well because we did. Like we went for Minister of Agriculture, we had several meetings trying to explain to them the objective of the project. And it turns out that we were successful in a way because by the time they were coming to the inception workshop, they already know what the objectives of the project were.
Good. Your experiences in Tanzania.
Okay, thank you very much. So at this stage, for the case of Tanzania, as you know, this project is actually hosted under Vice President Office, and basically they're dealing with the environment, and we have engagement with the Ministry of Agriculture as well. But of course, we don't foresee any challenge in terms of putting on board all these stakeholders together in the future. Of course, the main challenge has been the concern for environment and agriculture has been in terms of water availability, especially when you're talking of the Rufiji River Basin. We're talking of water availability for the environment vis-a-vis agricultural practices, which is going on upstream. So I don't foresee any challenge of engaging all the stakeholders and looking at different scenarios of policy change in engagement of the stakeholders.
Okay, in this state of the Thailand project, right now we haven't found any challenge yet, but from my previous experience in another project that I need to deal with the people from the government or farmer. So the first thing that we need to do is when we before starting the project, we need to talk to them in advance what we are doing and what outcome we are expect, and then we ask them to like help us to clarify or make some decisions that they are interested. So in this case, it's kind of like if they get involved since the starting of the projects, they are usually like we become like the co-worker, colleague, working together for entire project. So this is going to be the strategy that we plan to do. Yeah. But one thing that I experience but rarely happen is similar to the Kenya. Sometimes we're starting working with these people from these organizations, and then the project continue for some time, and then they change. So we need to start over again with the new one. So, but this happen, but rarely happen. Yeah.
Okay, well, I'd like to bring this session to a close, and I'd just like to thank the participants in a normal way, so thank you very much.